as the 2017 eclipse was approaching, the bunch of us at WADDU said, eclipse, radio. There must be something interesting to do with an eclipse and a radio. What do we know? As it happened, the University of Southern Illinois at Carbondale was running, they were at the epicenter of the eclipse. It was just a mile off campus. They asked us to come help run a special event station with them. When we found that the population of the town was going to triple and that city council had lifted all of their open alcohol carry rules for the eclipse event, we decided maybe that wasn't such a great idea to travel down there. But we happened to get in touch with Nathaniel and realized that he was running the Eclipse QSO party and that could be our niche. We had a wonderful time. We did a whole lot of community education that day, and we were happy to be part of data collection. So, Professor Frissell.
Thank you very much, David. So today I'm going to talk about the HF communications response to solar activity in September 2017 as observed by amateur radio networks. So this study comes out of some of the work that actually we did for the eclipse, because I'm again using reverse beacon network and now WhisperNet too, which I didn't use in the first study, to look at some of the responses. So some of you may know that there were numerous solar flares and coronal mass ejection induced interplanetary shocks that took place in early September of 2017. And this disrupted HF communications. Now, this was a particularly bad time for this because Hurricanes Irma and Jose caused significant damage to both to the Caribbean islands and parts of Florida. The timing was unfortunate because HF radio was needed for emergency communications. Many ham radio operators were deployed down to that area, or even some of the people in this room, were part of that emergency communication effort. So what we did was we looked at the WhisperNet and the reverse beacon network spots to look at how the amateur radio communications responded during this time and what kind of ionospheric impacts we could see from this. So everyone here knows how the amateur radio HF bands work and how they refract. For this study, I used 6 bands from the HF bands, going from 160 meters, 1.6 megahertz, up to 28 megahertz. And the ones that I chose, you can see, are highlighted in yellow. So those are the bands you will see throughout this presentation. And this is just a quick overview plot of the effect that a solar flare can have on the system. So on September 6th, 15 minutes before an X-class flare, you had, using WhisperNet and RBN, a total of 13,241 spots that were detected across all of these HF bands, and you can see those communications there. If you take the same data sets and look at the 15-minute period after the X-class solar flare, starting at 11:53 UT on 6 September 2017, you see a dramatic drop in the number of completed paths down to 2,594. So it's really a very dramatic shift. Now, to help visualize this more and separate things out by band, I took those spots and I created these histograms. These histograms are divided. This is looking at from 6 UT to 18 UT, and I've divided the histograms up into 10-minute bins going this way and into 250-kilometer bins on the y-axis. And you can now see the effects of the solar flare over Europe. And I've divided this, so we've got 28, 21, 14, and 7 megahertz bands. And the reason I chose over European spots over here is because this is where the daylight sector is. So you expect to have a solar flare that impacts the day side more than, say, the night side or the dawn side. And you can see what a dramatic effect this, there are 2 X-class flares. Here's the GOES data up here. Things were geomagnetically quiet. So here's KP all below 3/3+, and SIM-H was very near 0. So things are geomagnetically quiet there. But these solar flares cause a dramatic sudden stop in the HF communications, which we commonly know as a radio blackout. And this white dashed line is the solar zenith angle, so this is around noon. It affects all of the HF bands from 7 to 28 megahertz. I didn't show the lower bands because there actually wasn't much data there, but it's very quick. Sudden drop-off, you actually get a fairly quick recovery time on these flares from minutes to tens of minutes to, say, a few hours, and things can come back fairly well. So that's not so bad. If you look at the United States, the North American sector, this was on the dawn flank, so it was, the United States wasn't affected quite as badly by these flares because the flare was grazing the ionosphere on the side. So at 7 megahertz, you do see a sudden drop. 14 megahertz, you see a little bit of a drop, and you really see more of the effects of diurnal variations in the propagation. The 7 megahertz band, the propagation moves inward as the region absorption picks up. 14 megahertz was closed before dawn, and then it starts picking up. And 20 and 21 megahertz, they're barely active still in the morning hours, but you certainly don't see anything before the sun comes up. So there were also, in addition to these solar flares, there were also geomagnetic storms and activity that took place in early September. And this is a much more complicated response than the solar flares. So up on top, you can see the KP, which is in the green and reds over here, and SIMH, which is the black line. And so you can see starting, so this is now multiple days of data from 6 September through 12 September. You can now see that the storm onset took place at 21 UT on 8 September, and you see KP jumps up to 8 plus, and SIMH goes down to minus 146 nanoteslas, and this lasts for a good day or so until 9 September at 0 UT you get geomagnetic quiet, and you didn't start to see radio recovery until about 14 hours later. This is most prominent in the 14 and 7 megahertz bands, which you'll see in a minute. So we have all 6 bands here. So the question came up is, how do we know that this is different from like normal behavior? So I did a z-score on a statistical set of data. So I created a quiet time baseline looking at all of the days between 2016 and 2017 that had SIMH between minus 25 and plus 25 nanoteslas, and KP is less than 3, and that gave me a total of 283 quiet days. And so I just took that same period, I subtracted the mean of this data set divided by the standard deviation, and that's what you see here. So if you see reds, that is above normal amounts of propagation, and blues is below normal propagation. So you can see right when the geomagnetic activity hit, you really get a drop-off in both the 7 and 14 megahertz bands. It's clearly below average during the storm, and then things start to pick up again. On the lower bands, 1.8 and 3.5 megahertz, and also up here on 21 megahertz, things are a bit more inconclusive, most likely because there just wasn't enough spots to really do a good analysis. 28 megahertz is a little bit of a mystery, and this needs to be looked at a bit more because we actually do see an enhancement in propagation during the geomagnetic storm time, which I would have expected to not be there considering we had this storm. But still, there it is, so that needs to be looked at a little bit more carefully. If we look at just the spots in the Caribbean, between the United States and the Caribbean, you can see that this lasted for a very long time. So September 4th is over here. This is 10 days worth of data, going to September 14 over here on the 14 and 7 megahertz band. And you can see things are going along fine before the geomagnetic activity. Of course, you do get the flares that wipe a few things out. But once we get that storm, things stay down for quite a long time. And this is one of the things that really hurt the disaster communications. Now, the question might be, well, did the communication stop because there was a disaster? Did the antennas fall down? Did the hams just run out of power? That's, of course, a possibility. But looking at some other global data sets suggests that there was maybe something more that caused the ionosphere to not support that propagation. And the reason we say that is here is the daily average of the Caribbean and Whisper RBN spots for the same period. You can see NID trended it. So before the geomagnetic activity, things are up fairly high, and then you get a dip below, and then things start to recover, 8 or so days later. If you look at the global distribution of RBN and Whisper spots, you actually see somewhat of a similar trend where the global spot numbers are below average during this same period following the geomagnetic storm. And again, you might say, well, is something going on with the ham radio operators? Are they not there? But if you also look at the average total electron content as measured from the GPS network, you again see the same situation where you have higher TEC, total electron content, before the storm. For about 8 days following the storm, you have this below average condition, and then you see this recovery about 8 to 10 days later. And so this is definitely not going to be affected by whether or not ham radio operators are there. So this is showing that the total electron content over the United States was in fact diminished for this extended period of time, 8 to 10 days following the storm. So where normally you'd expect some sort of recovery just a few days after the storm. So in conclusion, we had X-class flares on 6, 7, and 10 September 2017, and we had acute radio blackouts during the day in the Caribbean with recovery times of tens of minutes to hours based on the decay time of a flare. There was a severe geomagnetic storm that took place on September 7th through 10th, with KP reaching 8+, and SIM-8 reaching minus 146 nanoteslas. And this wiped out the ionosphere communications on 14 megahertz and 7 megahertz. And the storm, combined with effects from additional flare and geomagnetic activity, contributed to a significant suppression of effective high-frequency propagation globally and in the Caribbean for a period of 12 to 15 days. Thank you.
And questions?
Board.
Top band operators, 160 meters and 80 meter operators know that in the first few hours after a major geomagnetic storm begins, propagation is often enhanced on long path between North America and Europe. And then the second night, it sucks. Okay. If you could put together a program by which there would be an alert, looks like we're going to have a geomagnetic field disturbance starting at X. We need all you guys to get on and give you data during this first night. I think that would be very fruitful because there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that this occurs, and so you could get in there and measure it. Plus, you've got a lot of motivated guys to get on and make contact.
Right.
So it's a good combination.
That's excellent. Thank you. Larissa and Ethan.
All right. So speaking of anecdotal evidence, some of you may know Fred Lawn, K3ZO, is an astute observer of propagation, and he always tells our contest club before a contest to watch out for 10-meter openings during and after geomagnetic storms. And I think a couple years ago I did an analysis on the HAMSI list that suggested that maybe that's not the case, but mine was not very detailed. So I think this is sort of interesting that you have evidence of that. And I'm sure Fred would be happy to hear it too. So anyhow, that's my comment.
Well, typically when you have storms in certain times of the year, you can, and at certain latitudes, you'll see like a positive phase of ionospheric electron densities followed by the negative phase, and it would probably be related to that, right? Yeah. Clarissa?
I was really interested in a signature where you could increase in 20. It was top panel on one of the figures. Even go on. Yeah, this one. Yes,
Right.
28 megahertz. And I do not see scales from here. To me, it looks really almost like periodic signature.
Mm-hmm.
And when do you see what's that period? When do you see those increases?
It's
And if you were able to connect them to
it's
anything.
daily. So this is a one day period. So one day, another day, another day. So it starts off right in the morning each day.
Okay, so and is it connected to any particular? So is it morning around sunrise, shortly after sunrise? When is it? When does it happen?
I'd have to separate the data out a little bit more in this plot because this is a global plot. So it's going to get smeared a little bit. But it's probably, it's mostly in the US and the European sector. So it's probably around sunrise. Aiden?
Off the last point, this data is normalized, so none of that daily motion would be the fact that people get up in the morning and are more active, right?
So no, all of those human factors are still in this. So we haven't removed that sort of quiet determination.
So the quiet
So that's
time
it.
only removes the ionospheric and magnetic changes?
Yeah, so right, so it just removes it does remove the actually, so no, when we do average those 283 days, this does show relative to what would normally be expected, even with like regular operating behavior, because that would be in that, still contained within that background data set, baseline data set. Yes.
Oh, cool.
Phil.
Okay, because Nathaniel's not going to do it, I want to give him a lot of credit for getting this through the review process. I got to see that happen, and that's one thing that this community is getting better at, but that's the challenge for us as scientists, is taking some of the variables we can't control here and convincing a refereed scientific community that, in fact, there's still usable information in there. We've just said twice, people weren't on. So I'm just going to try to say that forward reference, the Space Weather Station is an attempt to address some of that stuff that you immediately get back from a reviewer that basically says your sampling is biased. If you have something that's a more active signal, WWV, whatever it is, that's going to help a lot getting this stuff into journals. Because the review process should be hard, because that's the idea, is to filter out all the stuff that you'd love to have true but is not. So, but I give him a lot of credit for doing that, because you won't mention that yourself.
Thank you, Phil. I do want a couple other advertisements related to that. There's a question. So I've got two students here from NJIT who can raise their hand. We have Diego and Evan. And tomorrow during the demo session, they're going to show, we're starting to build up a website on the HamSci website, a database of these sorts of summary plots. So you can go to the HamSci website and every day and see what it looks like and see how it compares to the geomagnetic activity. So it's still in the early phases of this, but we do have a couple years worth of data out there. So you can see that tomorrow during the demo room, and they'll also have some copies of the peer-reviewed paper of this talk that you can pick up from them, or you can download it for free from the journal website. And I think we have one more question.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that a recent great example of the enhancement on the higher frequencies right at the initial phase of a geomagnetic storm was last October, the California QSO party. Those of us in the Midwest heard nothing on Saturday from California on 28 megahertz, nothing. But on Sunday, there were California stations all over the place. And I took a look at the Boulder ionosonde, It's kind of on the path from the Midwest out to the West Coast. Boulder takes data every 5 minutes, which is pretty good. Unfortunately, there's a Viper ionoson co-located there, which every once in a while there's one transmits when the other one's listening, and that really screws stuff up. But you can eliminate that data, but it shows that the MUF on the days preceding that storm was about 20 megahertz, which is typical for a solar minimum period. But on Sunday, the MUF spiked up to about 30 megahertz, and that made it very clear why there was California stations everywhere on Sunday. That was very dramatic. So.
Okay, thank you very much.